Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I still remember the exact sound of that voicemail notification. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that feels quiet and ordinary, the kind that never warns you your life is about to split clean in half. I was sitting at my desk, halfway through a spreadsheet, sipping coffee that had already gone cold, when my phone buzzed. I glanced down, expecting to see a work message or a spam call, but instead I saw one word that made my chest tighten instantly: Mom. It had been weeks since she'd called me directly. Our conversations had grown shorter over the past year, more careful, like both of us were stepping around invisible cracks in the floor. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the play button. Something in my stomach felt off, like the air before a storm when everything looks calm but smells wrong. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself it was probably just another update about the house repairs or a reminder to call Aunt Lillian. But when I finally pressed play, the voice that came through my speaker didn't sound like the mother who used to sing me to sleep when I was little. Her voice was tight, controlled, and cold in a way I had never heard before. "Don't come back," she said. There was a pause, just long enough for me to feel like maybe she would soften, maybe she would say my name, maybe she would explain. But she didn't. The message ended right there. 3 seconds of silence followed before the recording cut off completely. I sat there, frozen, staring at nothing, my heart beating so loudly it felt like someone knocking from inside my chest. My first thought wasn't anger. It wasn't even confusion. It was this hollow, sinking feeling that I had just lost something I didn't even know I was about to lose. Because you don't expect your own mother to erase you in 3 words. I tried calling her back immediately. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again, same thing. I texted, "Mom, what happened?" No response. I texted again, "Are you okay?" Still nothing. Hours passed, then a day, then 2. By the 3rd day, the silence itself felt like a message. That's when I knew something bigger was happening. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always explode into your life all at once. Sometimes it seeps in quietly, like water through a crack, until suddenly the whole foundation collapses. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs had been there for months. I just didn't want to see them. My mother and I had always been close. After my father died 8 years ago, it was just the 2 of us left holding on to that old family house. That house wasn't just property, it was history. My father built the back porch himself, plank by plank. He planted the oak tree in the front yard when I was born. He used to joke that he didn't trust contractors, so he trusted his own hands instead. Before he passed, he made it very clear what he wanted. He called me into his room, held my hand, and said, "This house stays in the family. It's yours one day. Promise me you'll protect it." I promised. And at the time, my mother promised too. That's why the voicemail didn't just hurt, it didn't make sense. For days after hearing it, I kept replaying her voice in my head, trying to detect something hidden beneath the words. Was she angry? Was she scared? Was someone forcing her to say it? None of it fit. Then a week later, the truth arrived in the most ordinary way possible. It came in the mail. I almost threw the envelope away without opening it. It looked like junk, just another official-looking letter with too many stamps and barcodes. But something about the return address caught my attention. It was from a real estate law firm in our hometown. My hands started trembling before I even opened it. Inside was a formal notification, a notice of pending property transfer. My mother had put the house up for sale. And not only that, the sale was already in progress. I remember reading that letter 3 times because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. It listed the buyer, the escrow timeline, the projected closing date, all of it planned without a single word to me. But the line that made my breath stop completely was buried near the bottom. It said the sale required approval from all trust beneficiaries, and there, printed clearly in black ink, was my name. That's when something inside me shifted, because my father hadn't just left me memories, he'd left me legal power. And suddenly those 3 words, "don't come back," felt very different. They didn't sound like rejection anymore. They sounded like a warning, or maybe a challenge. I sat there holding that letter, realizing for the first time that my mother hadn't just tried to push me away emotionally. She had tried to cut me out of something that was legally, morally, and personally mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt something toward her that I had never allowed myself to feel before. Not sadness, not confusion, but a quiet, steady anger. Because I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she thought I would just disappear quietly after hearing those 3 words, she didn't know me at all. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the letter resting on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift, replaying every conversation I'd had with my mother over the past year, searching for the moment everything changed. The hardest part wasn't the idea that she was selling the house. Houses can be sold. Walls can be rebuilt. What kept twisting inside me was the silence, the fact that she had chosen not to tell me at all. My mother was never a confrontational person. She believed in avoiding storms instead of walking through them. When I was a child, if something upset her, she would go quiet for hours, sometimes days before speaking again. She used to say, "Peace is more important than being right." But now, lying there in the dark, I realized something that made my throat tighten. Peace had never meant honesty to her. It had meant control. And this time, she had tried to control the outcome by cutting me out entirely. At around 3 a.m, I finally sat up, switched on the lamp, and read the letter again. The legal language was dense and cold, but one section stood out clearly. It stated that because the house had been placed into a family trust after my father's death, any sale required consent from all named beneficiaries. Without that consent, the transaction could be frozen indefinitely. Frozen. That word echoed in my mind like a door slamming shut. I wasn't powerless. Not legally, not emotionally, not anymore. I got out of bed, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were shaking so badly that some of it spilled onto the counter. I wiped it absently, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark window. I looked older than I remembered feeling just a week earlier. Tired, worn down, but there was something else there too, something steadier. Resolve. I whispered out loud, "You don't get to erase me." The next morning, I called the law firm listed on the letter. My voice felt strangely calm when the receptionist answered, like I had stepped into a role I didn't fully recognize yet. "I received a notice about a property sale. My name is listed as a beneficiary." There was a brief pause, followed by the soft clicking of a keyboard. "Yes," she said carefully, "you are listed as a co-beneficiary of the trust." Co-beneficiary. Not an afterthought, not optional, equal. I swallowed hard and asked the question that had been burning inside me all night. Can the sale proceed without my approval? Another pause. "No," she replied firmly, "it cannot." That single sentence felt like oxygen rushing back into my lungs. For the first time since hearing that voicemail, I felt like I had solid ground under my feet again. "Then I'd like to place a hold," I said. Even as I spoke the words, I felt a tremor run through me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the weight of what this meant. Because placing a hold wasn't just a legal action, it was a declaration. It meant stepping directly into conflict with my own mother. "Of course," the receptionist said, "we'll need written confirmation, but we can initiate a temporary freeze immediately." Temporary, but enough to stop everything. I closed my eyes and nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, please do that." When I hung up the phone, I expected to feel victorious, strong, empowered. Instead, I felt something much more complicated. Grief. Because even though I knew I had done the right thing, it still felt like something fragile between us had just cracked beyond repair. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time afterwards, staring at nothing, remembering the way my mother used to sit in that same spot years ago, drinking tea while sunlight poured through the window. She used to hum softly when she thought no one was listening. She used to reach out and squeeze my hand when I walked past. That woman felt so far away now. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Her name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I stared at it, watching it vibrate across the table, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever new pain might come through that line. But another part, the part that still loved her, couldn't let it go unanswered. I picked up. "Hello?" Her voice came through sharp and trembling. "What did you do?" There was no greeting, no warmth, just accusation. I closed my eyes slowly, steadying myself. "I stopped the sale," I said quietly. Silence filled the space between us, heavy and thick. Then she exhaled, a shaky sound that carried something I couldn't quite name. "You had no right," she said. That sentence hit me harder than anything else so far. "No right?" I repeated softly. "Mom, Dad put my name on the trust." "That was a mistake," she snapped. The words sliced straight through me. A mistake. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat burned and my chest felt like it had caved in. Because that wasn't just a legal disagreement. That was her rewriting history, rewriting him, rewriting me. Finally, I managed to whisper, "I was his daughter." Her voice rose with something that sounded dangerously close to panic. "You don't understand. You don't know what I've been dealing with. You left. You moved away. You built your own life. I stayed here. I carried everything alone." The accusation hung heavy in the air, and for the first time I heard something beneath her anger. Fear. But it didn't excuse what she had done. "You could have told me," I said quietly. There was a long pause. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "If you don't release the hold, you will regret it." The line went silent after that. She had hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling the weight of her words settle into my bones. Not sadness this time, not confusion, but a deep, chilling realization. This wasn't just about the house anymore. Something much bigger was hiding beneath the surface, and whatever it was, my mother was willing to threaten me to protect it. I didn't move for a long time after she hung up. My phone was still in my hand, the screen dark now, but it felt like it weighed 10 pounds. Her last words echoed in my mind over and over. "You will regret it." Not please, not let's talk, not even I'm sorry. A threat. From the woman who used to tuck blankets around my shoulders when I fell asleep on the couch. I set the phone down slowly, like it might explode if I handled it too quickly. My hands were cold, even though the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, warming everything it touched, except me. It wasn't just what she said that unsettled me. It was how she said it. There had been desperation in her voice, raw, almost frantic, and that desperation didn't match the story she was telling. Selling a house doesn't make someone sound like they're drowning, unless something else is forcing their hand. That thought settled deep in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. Because if she wasn't just selling by choice, then what was she hiding? I spent the rest of that day pacing between the kitchen and the living room, replaying memories like pieces of a puzzle scattered across the floor. Little things I had brushed off before suddenly felt sharp and suspicious. The way she'd stopped answering video calls months ago, claiming her camera was broken. The way she always sounded rushed when we spoke, like someone else was in the room. The way she'd refused my offer to visit during the holidays, saying she just wanted quiet this year. At the time, I told myself she needed space to grieve Dad. Now it felt like she had been keeping me away, intentionally. By evening, the knot of unease in my stomach had grown too tight to ignore. I did something I hadn't done in months. I called our old neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. She had lived next door to my parents for over 30 years, long enough to see me grow from a child riding a pink bicycle into the adult who eventually moved away. If anyone knew what was happening around that house, it would be her. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Well, if it isn't my favorite girl," she said gently. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Just hearing her voice made my throat tighten. "Hi, Mrs. Alvarez," I said softly. I wanted to ask you something." There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear her shift in her chair. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully. The question cracked something inside me. "I don't know. Has anything been going on with my mom lately?" Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that feels like someone choosing their words very carefully. Finally, she sighed. "I was hoping you'd call," she said quietly. My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then she spoke in a low voice, like she didn't want anyone nearby to overhear. "Your mother hasn't been alone," she said. The words hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. "Not alone?" I repeated. "There's a man," she continued gently. "He's been staying there for almost a year now." For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. A man? My mother had never mentioned anyone, not once. "What kind of man?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Alvarez hesitated. "I don't like him," she said finally. "He's controlling. He answers the door for her sometimes. He watches everything. And your mother, she's changed. She looks nervous all the time, thin, tired, like she's carrying something heavy." A cold chill spread through my chest. "What's his name?" I asked. Daniel Ross, I think." The name meant nothing to me, but the feeling it stirred inside me was immediate and sharp. Dread. "Has he been there every day?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And lately, they've had a lot of people coming by, men in suits, talking about paperwork, real estate signs. I thought maybe she told you." My stomach twisted. "No, I whispered. "She didn't tell me anything." Mrs. Alvarez's voice softened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't want to interfere, but I never liked the way he looks at her. It's not kind." Her words settled heavily in the silence between us. For the first time since this nightmare began, something shifted in my mind. This wasn't just betrayal. It might be something worse. Control, manipulation, maybe even fear. Because suddenly, my mother's voicemail didn't sound like rejection anymore. It sounded like someone trying to push me away to protect me, or protect herself. I hung up the phone feeling like the ground beneath my feet had tilted sideways. All the anger I'd been holding on to began to mix with something else. Worry. Real, sharp worry. Because if this man was involved in the house sale, then stopping it might have done more than anger my mother. It might have put her in danger. The thought made my chest tighten painfully. I walked to the window and stared out into the fading light, remembering the last time I saw her in person. She had hugged me tightly at the door, her arms lingering around me longer than usual. At the time, I thought she just didn't want me to leave. Now I wondered if she was trying to hold on to something she was already losing. I whispered softly into the empty room, "What's happening to you, Mom?" For the first time since hearing that voicemail, my anger faded into something far more complicated. A terrible, heavy realization. Maybe my mother wasn't the villain of this story. Maybe she was trapped inside it. And if that was true, then freezing the trust might have just set off a chain reaction I couldn't control. Because if someone else was pulling the strings behind the scenes, they wouldn't let go easily. That night, I couldn't stop picturing my mother inside that house, the same house where she once laughed easily, where she used to sing while cooking, where she danced barefoot in the kitchen with my father when they thought I wasn't watching. Now, every memory of that place felt shadowed by the image Mrs. Alvarez had planted in my mind. A man answering the door for her, watching everything, controlling the space that used to belong to us. I tried to tell myself I might be overreacting. People move on, widows find companions, life changes. But something in my gut refused to accept that simple explanation. It wasn't just that my mother had never mentioned this Daniel Ross. It was the way she sounded on the phone, sharp, desperate, almost frightened. And the threat she'd made didn't sound like someone confidently making a decision. It sounded like someone under pressure. I barely slept again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of childhood memories. My mother kneeling beside me when I scraped my knee, brushing my hair before school, whispering that no matter what happened in life, family was the one place you would always belong. The irony of that promise twisted painfully inside me now. By morning, I knew I couldn't just sit and wonder anymore. I needed facts. I needed to understand who this man was and what role he played in everything that was happening. So I did something I'd never imagined doing in relation to my own family. I searched him. It felt strange, almost wrong, typing his name into the computer, like I was crossing a boundary I never thought would exist between me and my mother's life. But the moment I pressed enter, the sense of unease I'd been feeling sharpened into something far more solid. Because Daniel Ross was not invisible online. There were records, news snippets, legal filings, Not front-page headlines, but enough to paint a picture that made my stomach turn. Several years ago, he had been involved in multiple civil disputes tied to property investments, disagreements with partners, accusations of coercive contracts, allegations that never quite rose to criminal charges but followed him like a shadow. In more than one case, older homeowners had claimed they were pressured into signing documents they didn't fully understand. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with each new piece of information. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't harmless companionship. This was a pattern. And suddenly, the timeline clicked into place in my mind. My mother had been alone after my father died, grieving, vulnerable, overwhelmed by maintaining the house by herself. She had always been trusting, especially with people who spoke confidently and offered solutions. It would have been easy for someone like him to step into that space, to present himself as helpful, reliable, necessary, and then, slowly, quietly, take control. The thought made my hands tremble with a mix of anger and fear, because if he had convinced her to sell the house, if he had isolated her from me, if he had pushed her to leave that voicemail, then this wasn't just a family conflict, it was something darker. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my fingers to my temples, trying to steady my breathing. The room felt too quiet, too still, like the air itself was holding its breath. One question kept repeating in my mind. Was she trying to push me away because she had chosen him, or because she was afraid of what he might do if I stayed involved? That question haunted me all day. By late afternoon, I couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. I knew there was only one way to find the answer. I had to go there. The idea of returning to that house, the place I had avoided since hearing her voicemail, filled me with a strange mix of dread and determination. Part of me was terrified of what I might see. Another part knew I couldn't protect her or even understand what was happening if I stayed distant. I packed a small bag that evening, almost mechanically, my mind moving faster than my hands. I told myself I was just going to observe, to talk, to assess the situation calmly. But deep down, I knew something had already shifted inside me. This wasn't just about stopping a house sale anymore. It was about reclaiming something that had been slowly stolen, piece by piece, from both of us. The drive the next morning felt longer than it had ever felt before. The familiar roads looked different, like memories seen through cracked glass. I passed the old diner where my father used to take me for pancakes, the park where my mother once taught me to ride a bike, the church whose bells used to mark the rhythm of our Sundays. Everything looked the same, but I felt completely different. By the time I turned onto our street, my heart was pounding so hard it almost hurt. The oak tree my father planted still stood in the front yard, its branches stretching wide and strong, just as he'd promised they would when I was a child. But something else had changed. There was a real estate sign planted firmly in the grass. Seeing it there felt like a physical blow, because it wasn't just a sign. It was a declaration that someone had already decided this house was over. I parked slowly, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before forcing myself to step out of the car. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken tension. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed small details that made my chest tighten. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, the porch plants were wilted and dry, and the wind chime my mother loved was silent, tangled and unmoving. It didn't feel like the home I remembered. It felt guarded. I raised my hand and knocked. For a few seconds there was no response. Then I heard footsteps inside. Not hers, heavier, slower. The door opened,
and the man standing there was not someone I had ever seen before, but I knew immediately who he was. His eyes scanned me from head to toe, sharp and calculating, like he was measuring something invisible. "Can I help you?" he asked flatly. I met his gaze steadily, forcing my voice not to shake. "I'm here to see my mother," I said. A faint, tight smile crossed his lips. "She's not available," he replied. And in that moment, every instinct inside me screamed the same thing. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a battle, and I had just stepped directly into it.
For a moment, neither of us moved. He stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance completely, one hand resting casually against the frame, like he had every right to decide who came in and who didn't. Up close, he looked older than I expected, late 50s, maybe early 60s, but there was nothing gentle about his face. His eyes were sharp, watchful, the kind that didn't just look at you, but tried to read what you were thinking underneath. "I didn't ask if she was available," I said quietly, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I said I'm here to see my mother." His smile tightened slightly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. "She's resting," he replied, "and she doesn't want visitors." Visitors. The word hit me harder than I expected, like I was a stranger standing on the doorstep of someone else's home. I felt a flash of anger rise in my chest, hot and immediate, but I kept my tone steady. "I'm not a visitor," I said. "I'm her daughter." For the first time, his eyes flickered with recognition, not surprise exactly, but calculation, like he had been expecting this moment eventually. "So," he said slowly, "you're the one who froze the trust." The way he said it, calm, almost amused, made a cold shiver run down my spine. This man wasn't confused. He knew exactly who I was, which meant my mother had told him, or worse, he had been involved from the beginning. I lifted my chin slightly. "Yes," I said, "I did." Silence stretched between us for a few seconds. Then he leaned one shoulder casually against the doorframe, as if settling in for a conversation he had already rehearsed. "That was a mistake," he said lightly. The same words my mother had used. My stomach tightened. "No," I replied. "What was a mistake was trying to sell that house without telling me." His eyes hardened just slightly. "You live far away. You built your own life. Your mother is the one who has been carrying the burden of that place alone for years." His tone was smooth, almost reasonable, but something beneath it felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. I shook my head slowly. "That doesn't give you the right to shut me out or to pressure her into something she doesn't fully understand." At that, his smile vanished completely. For a split second, the mask slipped, and what showed underneath wasn't anger. It was irritation, cold, controlled irritation. "You think you understand what's best for her?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze. "I think she should be able to speak for herself," I said. For a moment, the air between us felt electric, charged with something unspoken and dangerous. Then, from somewhere deeper inside the house, I heard a voice. "Daniel?" It was faint, tired, but unmistakably hers. My heart lurched. "Mom?" I called instinctively, stepping forward. His arm moved instantly, blocking the doorway. "She's resting," he repeated, his tone sharper now. But I had already heard her, and something in that single word she spoke, his name, had carried a weight that made my chest ache. Not affection, not warmth, strain. "Mom!" I called again, louder this time. There was a pause inside. Then I heard movement, slow, uneven footsteps. Daniel's jaw tightened. "She doesn't need this stress," he said under his breath, but it was too late.
A few seconds later, my mother appeared in the hallway behind him, and the sight of her hit me like a physical blow. She looked smaller, not just thinner, though she was that too, her cheeks hollow, her shoulders slightly hunched, but smaller in spirit, like something inside her had been slowly drained away. Her eyes, once bright and warm, looked tired and shadowed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other across the space between us. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Then she whispered, barely audible, "You shouldn't have come." The words stung, even though her voice carried no anger, only fear. I took a slow step forward. "Mom, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me about any of this?" Her gaze flickered toward Daniel for just a second, and that single glance told me everything, because it wasn't the look of a partner, it was the look of someone checking permission. My chest tightened painfully. "Everything is fine," she said quickly, her voice strained. "Daniel is helping me. The house is too much for me now. It's time to let it go." The words sounded rehearsed, like lines memorized rather than felt. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied, quietly. "You don't have to do this." Her eyes filled instantly with something that looked dangerously close to tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I want to, but you have to tell me the truth." Silence fell again. Daniel shifted slightly, his presence pressing into the space like a shadow. "She has told you the truth," he said calmly. "You're the one making this difficult." I ignored him completely, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "Mom," I said gently, "are you doing this because you want to or because you feel like you have to?" For a moment, her expression cracked, just slightly, and in that tiny fracture, I saw something that made my heart break. Fear, real, deep fear. But just as quickly, the crack closed. She straightened a little, her voice hardening in a way that sounded forced. "I want this," she said firmly, "and you need to release the hold." The words felt like ice sliding down my spine, because now I understood something terrible. This wasn't just about protecting a house, it was about protecting her, even if she couldn't say she needed it. I stood there on the porch, looking at my mother, and for a moment the world around us seemed to fade away. The only thing I could see clearly was the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She used to have steady hands, hands that could thread a needle without glasses, hands that once braided my hair so gently I would almost fall asleep while she worked. Now those same hands looked unsure, like they no longer belonged to her. "Mom," I said softly, ignoring Daniel completely, "you don't have to do this. You don't have to sell anything. If the house is too much, we can figure it out together." Her lips parted, and for a split second, hope flickered in her eyes. Then Daniel stepped slightly forward, not touching her, not speaking loudly, just shifting enough to remind her he was there. The hope vanished instantly. "You don't understand our situation," she said quickly, her voice tightening. "Daniel has helped me manage everything, the taxes, the repairs, the bills. I couldn't keep up alone." His name sounded heavy on her tongue, like a weight. I swallowed hard. "I could have asked me," I said quietly. Her eyes dropped to the floor. "You were busy," she whispered. "You had your life. I didn't want to burden you." The words hurt more than I expected because they weren't entirely untrue. I had moved away after Dad died. I had thrown myself into work, into building something stable, convincing myself that she was strong enough to manage without me. We still talked often, but it wasn't the same as being there. Guilt twisted inside me, sharp and uncomfortable. But guilt didn't explain this.
Being independent doesn't mean you had to shut me out, I said gently, and it definitely doesn't mean you had to sign away something Dad wanted protected. At the mention of my father, her face crumpled slightly. Daniel's voice cut in smoothly before she could respond. Your father isn't here anymore. Your mother is, and she deserves peace, not conflict. I turned toward him slowly, the anger I'd been holding back beginning to simmer closer to the surface. Peace doesn't come from secrecy. It doesn't come from isolating someone from their family either. His eyes narrowed just slightly. I think you're projecting your own guilt, he replied coolly. You left. She stayed. I helped her when you weren't around. The words were calculated, designed to hit exactly where it hurt. And they did. But I refused to let him see it. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, something cold flashed in his eyes. Not surprise, not anger, just calculation again, like he was adjusting his strategy. My mother suddenly spoke, her voice shaking. Please, she whispered, don't do this here. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She wasn't just tired physically, she looked emotionally drained, like someone who had been carrying stress for far too long without relief. That realization softened something inside me. I'm not trying to fight, I said gently. I just want to understand what's happening. Her gaze lifted slowly to meet mine. For a moment, I saw the mother I remembered, the one who used to sit on the edge of my bed during thunderstorms, telling me everything would be okay. Then she said something that made my heart sink. It's too late, she whispered. The words hung in the air, heavy with something final. What do you mean? I asked carefully. She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Daniel again before returning to me. The deal is almost done. There are obligations. Obligations. The word felt ominous. What kind of obligations? I asked carefully. Before she could answer, Daniel spoke. Financial ones, he said calmly. Your mother took out loans to maintain the property. Repairs aren't free, neither are taxes. The sale resolves everything. I felt a jolt of shock run through me. Loans? She never mentioned anything about debt. How much? I asked, my voice tight. He didn't hesitate. Enough that delaying the sale could create serious consequences. The way he said it made my stomach twist. Consequences for who? For her or for him? I looked back at my mother. Is that true? I asked softly. Her eyes filled with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. I didn't want you to worry, she whispered. It started small, just some repairs, then the roof, then medical bills last year. It kept adding up. My chest tightened painfully. Why didn't you tell me? I asked again, my voice breaking slightly. Because you already lost your father, she said quietly. I didn't want you to feel responsible for losing the house, too. The words struck deep, because suddenly I understood something that had been hidden beneath everything else. She wasn't just afraid of Daniel. She was afraid of failing my father's promise, and she thought selling the house would break me. So she had tried to push me away first, to make me hate her so it wouldn't hurt as much. The realization made tears sting my eyes, but it didn't change the bigger problem because something about this situation still didn't add up. Loans and repairs explained stress. They didn't explain secrecy. They didn't explain threats. They didn't explain why a man like Daniel Ross had inserted himself so completely into her life. I took a slow breath. Mom, I said gently, how much do you owe? She hesitated, then whispered a number that made my heart drop.
It was far higher than I expected, far higher than simple repairs would justify. And in that moment, one terrible possibility snapped into focus. She hadn't just borrowed money, she might have borrowed it from him. I looked slowly toward Daniel, and for the first time since arriving, I saw something unmistakable in his expression. Possession. Like he believed this entire situation, this house, this debt, even my mother herself, belonged to him now. A cold, steady certainty settled inside me. This wasn't just a bad deal, it was a trap, and if I didn't act carefully, freezing the trust might not be enough to break it.
The number my mother whispered kept echoing in my head long after she said it. It wasn't just large, it was crushing. The kind of debt that doesn't come from a few repairs or a temporary hardship. It was the kind that grows quietly over time, tightening like a noose until there's no room left to breathe. I forced myself to stay calm, even though my pulse was pounding in my ears. "How did it get that high?" I asked softly. My mother hesitated, her fingers twisting together nervously. Before she could answer, Daniel stepped in smoothly, his tone controlled. "Emergencies happen," he said. "Medical bills, structural issues, property taxes. She didn't have anyone else to rely on, so I stepped in." I looked at him steadily. "You loaned her the money?" He didn't blink. "Yes," he replied simply. The word landed like a stone dropping into deep water. There it was, the truth. My mother wasn't just emotionally entangled with him, she was financially trapped. And now everything made sense. The pressure to sell quickly, the secrecy, the threats. Because if the house sold, he would be repaid immediately, possibly with a significant profit attached through interest or contractual clauses she likely hadn't fully understood. I turned back to her. "Did you sign loan agreements?" I asked gently. Her eyes dropped again. "Yes," she whispered. "Did you have a lawyer review them?" Silence. That silence answered everything. A sharp ache spread through my chest, not anger at her, but pain at how alone she must have felt to reach that point without asking me for help. Daniel crossed his arms, his tone turning colder. "She's an adult," he said. "She made her choices. You freezing the trust only complicates things and increases her stress." I met his gaze, feeling something inside me harden. "No," I said quietly. "It prevents her from losing everything." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Everything?" he repeated. "Yes," I said, "because if this sale goes through under pressure, she may end up with nothing after debts and penalties." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "She knows exactly what she's doing," he replied. I looked at my mother again. "Do you?" I asked gently. Her eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over. "I just wanted it to stop. The bills, the fear, the letters. Daniel said selling would make everything go away." Her voice cracked on the last word. That sentence broke something inside me, because it revealed the simple, painful truth. She hadn't chosen this out of greed or selfishness. She had chosen it out of exhaustion, out of fear, out of believing she had no other option. I stepped forward slowly. "You're not alone," I said softly. "You never were." Daniel's voice cut in sharply. She was alone until I helped her. I turned toward him, no longer trying to hide the steel in my voice. Helping someone doesn't mean isolating them from their family. I didn't isolate her, he replied coolly. You did that yourself by leaving. The accusation struck deep, but this time, instead of guilt, it sparked clarity. Because I finally understood his strategy. He wasn't just controlling the finances, he was controlling the narrative, convincing her she had been abandoned, convincing her she owed him loyalty, convincing her she had nowhere else to turn. And for a while, it had worked. I took a slow breath. "Mom," I said gently, keeping my focus on her, "did you want me to stay away? Or did you think it was the only way to protect me from all this?" Her shoulders trembled. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she whispered the words that made my heart ache. "I didn't want you dragged into this mess." Tears slid down her cheeks. "He said if you got involved, it could get complicated, legal, stressful. I thought pushing you away would make it easier for you." I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that truth. She hadn't rejected me. She had been trying, in her own painful way, to shield me. But in doing so, she had walked straight into his trap. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," I said. "We can fix it, together." Daniel's expression hardened. "It's not that simple," he said sharply. "There are contracts, timelines, legal obligations." "Yes," I replied calmly, "and those contracts can be reviewed, challenged if necessary." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "You think you can just undo everything?" he asked. "No," I replied, "but I can make sure she understands everything before losing her home." Silence filled the space again. My mother looked between us, her face torn with conflicting emotions, fear, hope, guilt, exhaustion. Finally, she whispered something that shifted the entire moment. "I don't want to sell." The words were quiet, but they landed like thunder. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "What?" he said sharply. Her hands trembled, but she repeated it, a little stronger this time. "I don't want to sell." For a long moment, no one spoke, because in that single sentence, everything changed. It wasn't just about stopping a transaction anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice. And for the first time since I arrived, I saw something return to her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. A spark of courage. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not realistic," he said coldly. "You can't repay what you owe without the sale." I stepped forward slightly. "Then we'll find another way," I said firmly. His gaze shifted to me, sharp and calculating again. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I held his stare. "No," I replied calmly. "It's just beginning." And deep inside, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a financial battle. It was a fight to free my mother from debt, from fear, and from a man who had quietly taken control of her life piece by piece. And I wasn't going to walk away again. Not this time. The moment my mother said she didn't want to sell, the entire atmosphere in that hallway shifted. It was subtle at first, just a tightening in the air, like the feeling before a storm finally breaks, but it was unmistakable. Daniel's expression didn't explode into anger. That would have been easier to face. Instead, It went completely still, his eyes narrowing in a way that made a cold chill slide down my spine. Because men like him don't shout when they lose control. They calculate. "That isn't a practical decision," he said quietly, his voice almost calm again. "You're under a great deal of stress. You're not thinking clearly." I saw my mother flinch slightly at his words, and in that small reaction, I recognized something painful. She had heard this tone before, many times. The tone that sounded reasonable on the surface, but carried a deeper message underneath. "You're not capable. You need me." I stepped forward just a little, positioning myself closer to her without touching her, creating a silent barrier between them. "She's thinking clearly enough to say what she wants," I said evenly. Daniel didn't look at me. His gaze stayed fixed on her. "You understand what this means?" he asked her softly. "You won't be able to cover the debt. Interest continues. Legal enforcement becomes inevitable." The words were carefully chosen, technical, intimidating, heavy with implied consequences. My mother's shoulders trembled again. I could see the old fear creeping back into her expression, but this time something else was there too. She looked at me, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't glance back at him before speaking. "I understand," she said quietly. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You signed agreements," he reminded her. "Those are binding." "Yes," she whispered, "but I signed them because I was scared, because I thought I had no other choice." Her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't look away. "I don't want to keep living afraid," she said. The words felt like they echoed through the entire house, because that's what this had really been about all along. Not just money, not just property. Fear. The kind that grows slowly, silently, until it becomes the air you breathe without even realizing it. Daniel finally looked at me, and this time the politeness in his expression was gone. "You're interfering in something you don't fully understand," he said coldly. I met his gaze without flinching. "I understand enough," I replied calmly, "enough to know this situation needs legal review." At that, his eyes sharpened slightly. "Legal review," he repeated. "Yes," I said, "every loan agreement, every contract, every interest term." For the first time, something like genuine irritation surfaced in his face, because men who rely on control don't like scrutiny. They don't like transparency. They don't like outside eyes. My mother looked between us, her voice small but steady. "I didn't read everything carefully," she admitted. "I trusted you." The hurt in her words hung heavily in the air. For a brief second, something flickered across Daniel's face, not guilt exactly, but something close to defensiveness. "I helped you when no one else did," he said. "I know," she whispered, "and I was grateful, but help shouldn't feel like a cage." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else, because for the first time, she wasn't just agreeing with him, she was challenging him, and that meant his hold was weakening. A long silence followed, then he exhaled slowly, straightening his posture. "If you delay this process, the financial consequences will be severe. You could lose more than just the house." I stepped in before my mother could respond. "We're prepared to review options," I said firmly, "including repayment restructuring." His eyes snapped toward me. "You think you can handle that kind of debt?" "Yes," I replied steadily, because unlike before, she isn't facing it alone anymore. The words seemed to echo through the hallway, and something inside me shifted when I said them, because they weren't just a statement to him, they were a promise to her. My mother's hand moved slightly, hesitating, then reaching toward mine.
When our fingers touched, I felt her trembling, but also a quiet strength returning, like someone finally remembering they aren't standing in the dark by themselves anymore. Daniel watched the gesture closely, and for the first time I saw something new in his expression, not just irritation, concern. Because control is easiest when someone is isolated, but isolation had just been broken. "This isn't finished," he said quietly. "No," I replied calmly. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he stepped back from the doorway. Not leaving, not conceding, but retreating just enough to signal something important. The balance of power had shifted. Slightly, but undeniably. After he moved away, the silence inside the house felt completely different. Still tense, still uncertain, but no longer suffocating. My mother squeezed my hand weakly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything, for the voicemail, for pushing you away." Tears filled my eyes. "You thought you were protecting me," I said softly. She nodded, her face crumpling. "I didn't realize I was losing myself instead." I pulled her gently into a hug. She felt fragile, like she had been carrying too much weight for too long, but she also felt real again, present, not distant, not hidden behind fear. And in that moment, I realized something deeply important. Freezing the trust hadn't just stopped a house sale, it had interrupted a cycle of control. It had created space for truth, for courage, for connection to return. But I also knew something else. This wasn't over, because men like Daniel don't give up easily, and debt, especially the kind tangled in complicated contracts, doesn't disappear overnight. We had taken the first step, but the real fight was still ahead, and it would require more than determination. It would require strategy, strength, and the willingness to face truths that might be even harder than the ones we'd already uncovered.
That evening, after Daniel retreated into the back part of the house, my mother and I sat together at the kitchen table for the first time in what felt like years. The room looked almost the same as I remembered, the faded floral curtains, the small crack in the corner tile near the sink, the wooden clock on the wall ticking steadily as it always had. But the energy inside the space felt completely different. It felt fragile, like something broken was slowly trying to mend. My mother kept both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Her fingers still trembled slightly, but there was something steadier in her posture now, not confident yet, but no longer defeated. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered after a long silence. I leaned forward slightly. "You could have told me anything," I said gently. She shook her head slowly. "You had just started rebuilding your life after your father died," she said. "You were finally stable, happy again. I didn't want to drag you back into all this." Her voice cracked. "And when the debts started growing, it felt like I had already failed him." My chest tightened painfully. "Failed him?" I repeated softly. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "He trusted me to protect the house," she whispered. "He trusted both of us, and I thought if you knew I was losing it, you'd look at me differently." The weight of her guilt hung heavy in the air. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. "I would never look at you that way," I said quietly. "Not for struggling, not for needing help." Her shoulders shook as she finally let the tears fall freely. "I was so tired," she admitted. "Every letter in the mail felt like another warning. Every bill felt like proof that I was failing. When Daniel offered help, it felt like a lifeline." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I didn't see how tightly it would wrap around me." Her words painted a picture that was painfully clear. It hadn't started as control. It had started as relief. Someone stepping in when she felt alone, someone offering solutions when she felt overwhelmed, and slowly, over time, that help had turned into dependence, then into obligation, then into fear. How did it change? I asked gently. She stared down at her hands for a long moment. At first, he was kind, she said quietly. He handled paperwork, spoke to contractors, explained things I didn't understand. But after the first loan, he started making decisions without asking me, saying it was faster that way. Her voice trembled. Then the debts grew, and he would remind me how much I owed him, not angrily, just calmly, like it was a fact I couldn't escape. A cold heaviness settled in my chest. "Did he ever threaten you?" I asked carefully. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Not directly," she whispered, "but he would talk about legal consequences, about how quickly things could spiral if payments weren't made, about how complicated it would be if family members interfered." Her eyes lifted to meet mine, filled with regret. "That's why I left that voicemail," she said softly. "I thought if I pushed you away, you wouldn't get caught in it. You wouldn't get hurt." The memory of those 3 words, "don't come back," still stung, but now, hearing the fear behind them, they felt completely different. They weren't rejection, they were desperation. "You weren't protecting me," I said gently. "You were isolating yourself." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks again. "I see that now." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, I took a deep breath. "Mom," I said softly, "we need to look at every contract you signed, every detail, because if he pressured you or didn't explain terms properly, some of those agreements may not hold up legally." Her eyes widened slightly. "You think so?" "Yes," I said firmly, "especially if there was emotional pressure involved." A flicker of cautious hope appeared in her expression. "But what if we can't fix it? What if the debt is too large?" I squeezed her hand gently. "Then we face it together, not with fear, not alone." The words seemed to settle something deep inside her. For the first time, she exhaled fully, like someone finally letting go of a breath they'd been holding for years. "You sound just like your father," she murmured. A lump formed in my throat. "He believed in facing problems head on," she continued softly. "I forgot that somewhere along the way." I smiled faintly through my own tears. "Then let's remember together." Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing the documents she had given me. Loan agreements, interest schedules, repayment clauses, some of them written in dense legal language that would have been confusing even for someone experienced. But one thing stood out immediately. Several contracts contained unusually high interest rates, and some included clauses that allowed accelerated repayment demands if the borrower attempted to transfer property or seek outside legal review. In other words, they were designed to trap her. A cold determination settled inside me as I read. This wasn't just poor financial management, it was predatory, carefully structured to keep her dependent and fearful. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the stack of papers. For the first time since this nightmare began, my path forward felt clear. We needed a lawyer, not just to review the contracts, but to challenge them, because this wasn't simply about stopping a house sale anymore. It was about breaking a system of control that had been quietly tightening around my mother for years. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel Ross
would not let that happen without a fight. But this time, he wasn't facing someone alone. He was facing both of us.
The next morning felt different from every other day since this ordeal began. For the first time in months, maybe years, my mother woke up without immediately checking the mailbox, without scanning her phone for messages, without that constant tension pulled tight across her shoulders. She still looked tired, still fragile, but there was something new in her expression. Relief. Not complete, not secure, but real. We sat together at the kitchen table again, sunlight filtering through the curtains, turning dust motes into tiny floating sparks in the air. She wrapped her hands around a fresh cup of tea, and this time she actually took a sip. "I forgot how quiet mornings could feel," she said softly. Her words struck me more deeply than she probably realized, because that simple sentence revealed just how long she had been living in constant stress. "We're going to make sure you get many more quiet mornings," I said gently. She looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and lingering worry. "I still feel scared," she admitted. "What if he fights back? What if the legal process takes years?" I nodded slowly. "Those are real possibilities," I said, "but fear doesn't get to make our decisions anymore." She absorbed that quietly, her shoulders straightening just a slight bit. After breakfast, I made the call to a property attorney recommended by a colleague of mine, someone experienced in predatory lending cases and elder financial exploitation. The moment I explained the situation, the tone on the other end of the line shifted from polite professionalism to focused seriousness. "We'll need to review everything," the lawyer said, "but from what you've described, there may be strong grounds to challenge some of those agreements." Hearing those words felt like a door opening, not a guarantee of victory, but proof that we weren't powerless. My mother listened to the call from across the table, her eyes filling with cautious hope. When I hung up, she whispered, "You really think we can fight this?" I reached for her hand again. "I know we can try, and sometimes trying is the most powerful step of all." That afternoon, Daniel returned to the house after being gone most of the morning. His presence felt different now, not dominating, not quietly controlling the air the way it had before. Instead, it felt tense, watchful, like he was recalculating every move. He stood in the doorway of the living room, his gaze moving between us. "I assume you're moving forward with legal counsel," he said calmly. It wasn't a question. I met his eyes steadily. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once, slowly. "You understand that this will complicate matters. Legal disputes can be costly, stressful, lengthy." My mother surprised both of us by speaking first. "I've been living with stress for a long time already. At least now I won't be facing it alone." For a split second, genuine surprise flickered across his face, because that was something he hadn't anticipated. Her voice, her independence, her willingness to stand without his approval. He recovered quickly, his expression settling back into calm detachment. "Very well, then we'll let the process play out." There was no anger, no threats, but the underlying message was clear. This was far from over. He turned and walked toward the back of the house, his footsteps measured and quiet. After he disappeared from view, my mother let out a slow breath. "I don't feel as small anymore," she murmured. Her words brought an unexpected sting to my eyes. "You were never small. You were just carrying too much alone." She smiled faintly. Maybe I needed someone to remind me of that. The following weeks were not easy. There were long meetings with lawyers, stacks of documents to review,
tense exchanges through formal legal channels. Some contracts were upheld, others showed clear evidence of unfair terms and inadequate disclosure. Negotiations began, slow, complex, but moving steadily. And through it all, something else was happening quietly beneath the legal battle. My mother was healing. Each day, she moved a little more freely around the house. She opened the curtains again, she watered the porch plants, she even untangled the old wind chime and hung it back in its place. The first time it rang softly in the breeze, she stopped and listened, tears shining in her eyes. "It sounds like home again," she whispered. And in that moment, I realized something deeply important. This fight had never truly been about the house. It had been about reclaiming her sense of safety, her sense of belonging, her voice. Months later, after negotiations and legal pressure, a settlement was reached. Some debts were restructured, others were significantly reduced due to predatory lending findings. Daniel withdrew from the property and financial agreements entirely under legal advisement. The day everything was finalized, my mother and I stood together in the front yard, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows across the grass. She looked at the house for a long time before speaking. "I almost let fear take this away," she said softly. I slipped my arm around her shoulders. "Fear didn't win because you found your courage again." She leaned her head gently against mine. "And because you came back," she whispered. I smiled faintly. I was never truly gone. The wind chime rang softly above us, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt peaceful. The months that followed were a slow, careful rebuilding, not just of the house, but of our lives, our relationship, and my mother's sense of self. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand gestures or sudden breakthroughs. It was quiet, steady, and deeply human. Small things marked our progress. Mornings without panic, conversations without avoidance, laughter returning to the kitchen, the smell of her cooking filling the house again. We began going through each corner of the home together. Files, letters, receipts, every scrap of paper that had once been a source of anxiety was examined, discussed, and understood. What had once been a labyrinth of fear slowly became a map of recovery. She asked questions freely now, no longer intimidated by fine print or subtle threats. For the first time in years, she was not alone in facing her own life. We also began reaching out to other family members who had been unintentionally pushed aside by her silence. Cousins, aunts, old family friends, they had noticed the distance too, but hadn't known how to help. I explained everything as carefully as I could, without placing blame, without stirring shame. They were eager to step in, to support, to create a network around her that was previously missing. The house itself seemed to respond to this healing. Each morning as the sun rose over the familiar oak tree my father had planted, light spilled across the living room, catching dust particles like tiny sparks of hope. I watched my mother move through the rooms with confidence she hadn't had in years, straightening cushions, dusting shelves, watering plants. She smiled more now, not at me or anyone in particular, but because she was home in her own life again. There were still reminders of what happened, of course. Daniel Ross had left his mark, not physically, but emotionally. I could see it in the lingering wariness in my mother's eyes, in the careful pauses before she made decisions, in the way she sometimes hesitated when signing documents or answering unexpected calls. But each time we worked through a task together, every day she reclaimed a little more freedom. One evening, a few months after the legal settlement, we sat on the porch with the sun dipping low over the neighborhood. The wind chimes swayed gently above us. My mother sipped her tea slowly,
then looked at me, a softness in her expression I hadn't seen since my father passed away. "You know," she said quietly, "I was terrified for a long time. I thought I had to handle everything alone, and I thought if I pushed you away, you'd be safe. But I see now that being alone isn't safety, it's isolation." I squeezed her hand. "You're not alone anymore," I said, "and you never were meant to be." She looked out at the street, then back at me. "I forgot that," she admitted, "but you reminded me. You reminded me that family can be stronger than fear." There was silence for a while, the kind that doesn't feel empty but full, full of everything we had endured, everything we had overcome, everything still to come. I realized then that the house, the trust, and our bond, it had all been a test of endurance, of love, and of courage, and somehow, through the fear, the anger, and the sleepless nights, we had survived. Eventually, the day came when my mother decided to host a small gathering for close friends and neighbors, people who had watched over her from a distance, who had noticed her isolation, who had quietly hoped someone would intervene. I watched her greet each person with laughter, genuine warmth, her voice confident, her posture upright. The woman who had once been trapped by fear and debt was back, not just physically, but emotionally. Later that night, after the guests had gone, we sat in the living room together, a calm settling over the house. I noticed how naturally she reached for the framed photo of my father on the mantel, brushing her fingers over it and whispering, "We made it through." I smiled softly. "You made it through," I corrected gently. "We made it through, together." She nodded, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I couldn't have done it without you. Not just legally or financially, but to remember how to trust myself again." I felt a quiet ache in my chest, a mix of relief, pride, and lingering sorrow for the months lost to fear. "You'll never have to be alone in that again," I said softly, "no matter what happens." For the first time in years, the house felt truly alive, not because of the furniture or the walls or the oak tree in the yard, but because of the life inside it. Our laughter returned, our shared memories returned, and something new emerged, a mutual respect and trust that could withstand anything, even the manipulations of someone who had once held her in fear. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, reviewing some final paperwork from the settlement, when my mother came in quietly and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening, for staying, for trusting me enough to fight with me." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "No," I said softly. "Thank you for letting me back in, for letting me protect you the way I should have before." She smiled, small and quiet, but full of meaning. "I think I finally understand what Dad always meant. Family isn't just about being together in the easy times, it's about showing up when it matters most, when everything is at risk. That's how you protect each other. That's how love works." I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to breathe fully, not in relief alone, but in the knowledge that the storm had passed and we had survived it together. The house, the trust, and our bond were no longer things under threat. They were ours, reclaimed piece by piece, not because it was easy, not because the world guaranteed it, but because we chose to fight for them, together. I stayed up late that night, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The wind chimes swayed gently in the cool breeze. Outside, the street was peaceful. Inside, I felt something stronger than fear, stronger than anger, stronger than any threat that had loomed over us. Hope. And in that quiet, I realized the truth of everything we had endured. Fear can be isolating. Betrayal can feel like the end. Debt, manipulation, and control can shadow every corner of life. But love, family, and courage, when they are real, they endure. They protect, they reclaim what has been lost. I thought of the voicemail again, the 3 words that had terrified me at first. Don't come back. Now I understood. My mother hadn't meant them as rejection. She had meant them as protection. And I had learned that protection doesn't always come in the way you expect. Sometimes it comes quietly in fear and silence, and sometimes it comes through you by returning, by staying, by refusing to let someone else write the story for your family. The house was ours again, the trust was intact, and my mother, my brave, resilient mother, was finally free. I whispered softly, almost to myself, as I turned off the kitchen light and walked to my room. We're home again, and this time we stay. Outside, the wind chime rang once more, a soft, delicate note that carried through the warm night air. It felt like a promise, a memory, and a beginning all at once. And for the first time in a long time, I knew we had truly arrived. Together.